modes for me were kind of a natural attraction. Like I said a few minutes ago, I've only been in amateur radio for a year and a half, and I've spent all of my career so far in software. Even though I'm an electrical engineer, I do software for a living, and hardware is my outlet, and ham radio is my outlet, but I have natural affinity for the technology behind the digital modes, and plenty of PCs and all the rest of it, of course. So I got started into the digital modes pretty quick, and have found, because I live in a pretty dense residential area, I have a 40-meter off-center fed dipole that is about as much as I'm going to erect anytime soon, being in a dense residential area. And because of that, the digital modes have been also very attractive because the propagation characteristics of them, just like CW, is great compared to voice. So I've been able to work anywhere in the world, depending on the conditions, on digital modes, whereas on voice, I'm lucky if I can get 2 states over on sideband. So they're great for that, and great for folks that may be a little shy, or that want to make a lot of contacts in a smaller period of time, or want to do DX under the conditions like I operate. So they're pretty cool. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go over just the basic, most popular modes that people are using. There's over 20 of them right now. Some of them you could call experimental. They're fairly new and recent. Some of them have been around for a while, and I'll kind of call that out when we go through it. But I'm not going to go through an exhaustive list. It would just take too much time. But basically, digital modes all have one thing in common. They're a way through the amateur radio service to connect one machine, a computer, to another machine, another computer, and either convey messages or pictures, sounds even, video, or beacons, which has been a fairly popular thing the last couple of years, and I am going to talk about that particular one. And the other thing that's nice about digital modes is that they work under all conditions, and I'll touch on some specific examples. As you know, last night we were getting a lot of lightning off in the distance and a lot of static discharges and such. The QRM was fairly high at times, in addition to the conditions not being all that great in general, it seemed, last night. So it was a perfect time to get some screen captures off the waterfall for this presentation anyway. So all the digital modes, the other thing they all do is they all encode and decode information of some kind. And what you need to get started is you need some kind of computing device, typically a laptop or a tablet, the kind of thing that many of us are already using in our stations anyway for logging software or what have you. And then some kind of a rig interface along with a particular piece of software of your choosing to be able to communicate using the digital modes. Now, the rig interfaces vary. They can go from anything from homebrew, certainly on the receive side, you really only need an audio cable and the software. So if all you were doing is just trying this out on the receive side, you don't need any special equipment other than that audio cable and that software. For rig control at kind of the other end of the spectrum, if you want the whole 9 works, I own a copy of Ham Radio Deluxe, so you get all the logging and all the control and everything all integrated together. So you need a little box of some kind to interface to your rig. My rig happens to be like 20 years old. It's an ICOM 765. So there are boxes out there that will interface to rigs 20, 30 years old and, of course, forward. And the newer rigs now, the ICOM 7000 series, the new FT 3000, 1200, FTDX 3000 and 1200, and the new Kenwood, in particular TS990, pretty much all come now with the ability to decode the most popular digital modes, and also the high-end rigs allow you to plug in a USB attached keyboard and then be able to type. So the modes that are text-based, you're able to do just with your radio and no external equipment, really, just a couple cables for the audio. And for the most part, just like pretty much everything else in the amateur radio service, it all runs lower sideband on the lower bands and upper sideband on the higher bands, and just as you'd expect. Okay, so I mentioned that. Basically, what's happening here with the software is advances in digital signal processing software for the most part. The hardware had to be there anyway, but that's improved as time's gone on. So now you actually have, even though it's within the audio range of frequencies, some fairly sophisticated digital signal processing capabilities in the average laptop or tablet now. The tablets, I keep mentioning tablets, and cell phones are even possible. There's less capability there right now, but that's kind of coming with newer phones and newer tablets with more standardized interfaces like USB that actually you can send data back and forth. They're not just using the USB, say, for recharging the tablet. The most popular packages out there, and I should have, in fairness, covered kind of the Linux space. Most of these go in both Windows and Linux or Mac as well. But there are a couple of special software packages out there that are pretty much just targeted at the Linux market or the Linux users out there. But in the Windows space, you have FLDigi, MixW, and DM780, which is Digital Master, as part of the Ham Radio Deluxe suite that's there. And as I said earlier, there are about 20 plus modes now that are available. The thing about the different modes is, and what I try to capture in this point, is that they serve different purposes. So it may sound like a bunch of overkill, and to some degree it is. The text modes, of which there's about 10 maybe, or almost half of those 20, are kind of overkill. But the different modulation techniques and encoding schemes that they use give you a lot of variation under different conditions. And I'll touch on that a little bit more. Other than CW, which of course is actually truly the oldest, or Morse code, truly the oldest digital mode, RTTY comes to mind, and is certainly something that, unlike CW, is a bit easier to decode accurately with PC software. And typically it runs at a 45 baud or 45 bit per second rate at 170 hertz of shift between the mark and the space, the zeros and the ones, if you will. It's using a technique called audio frequency shift keying, so it's essentially varying a tone 170 hertz between that mark and space. And on the waterfall display, that's why you get the two lines that you see here. And probably of all of the audio clips I have, this is probably the one that everybody has already heard. Right, because whether you've listened on shortwave bands or on your own amateur gear, that sound is a fairly familiar one. I might add, back in the day, when I was just a shortwave listener, I spent no end of amounts of energy trying to build hardware to decode RTTY back 30 years ago. And it was very difficult back then to do it just with a pure hardware solution until the DSP software capabilities came about. And the very first time I was able to decode RFID, I was, yes, fist pump, because it had been so many years in the making from when I first started hearing that warbling sound. Okay, PSK is pretty much the thing that made the digital modes take off and became very popular fairly quickly, and it still remains today, after a few years, the most congested, most active area of the bands where PSK is active. What it does is there's essentially two kinds of PSK, which stands for phase shift keying. The binary phase shift keying, which is essentially just a 0-degree reference and 180-degree reference shift, okay, for between the 0 and the 1. And then the quadrature phase shift keying, which gets into a little bit more complexity, but has much better characteristics and provides error correction, which regular PSK does not. So when you're operating PSK, you will get character drops or misprints every once in a while, but it's good for about 95% or greater most of the time. It's really not a major issue or a major irritant. Under good conditions of low QRM, PSK can be very low down in the noise signal-wise, not even coming up off the stub of the meter. Okay, so down minus 30, 40 dB, and you'll still be able to get perfect prints out of it. So the technology works fairly well in practice, given how simplistic it really is. The most popular version of PSK is PSK 31. The numbers oftentimes refer to the bandwidth or the shift in frequency when that's applicable. PSK 31 is a 31 hertz shift in tone. 63 and 125, which are starting to pick up in popularity, are 63 hertz and 125 hertz. And now folks are experimenting with 250 hertz. 63 is fairly common to catch on the waterfall nowadays. It's not rare at all. 125 is a little more rare. And in consideration for everyone else, what people are doing typically, because in a typical band, a band pass of 2,500 hertz, which is in sideband, you'd use all of it, right? In PSK 31, you can have 15 or 20 QSOs in that same single channel space that single sideband would operate in. Okay, each, independent of each other. 63 uses twice as much roughly, and 125 4 times as much as that 31 hertz shift. So in respect to other people's use of the bands, people have stayed away from 63 and 125 and some of these other modes quite as much because of how much bandwidth they take. But one thing that's happening is on 20 meters on 14070, which most of your PSK 31 has centered around, it's creeping up to 72, 73, almost up into where some of the other modes you'll see live typically. Yeah.
I really know nothing about this. What would be the benefits of PSK 125 to PSK 31?
Speed.
Yeah. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. See, the way the software works is, and the way you have to work it as an operator, because foreign operators oftentimes will make a two-pass exchange QSO. So you'll come back and call them. They'll respond, you'll exchange signal reports, and the QSO's done, right? So it's very much like RTT, especially during contests that way, RTTY during contests.
In baud, what's the difference in baud between those two?
Roughly about that frequency is baud rate. So, if you're going to type real time on PSK 31, you don't have to be a great typer to do that. I'm going to talk about another mode that you could pretty much go get a coffee in between keystrokes and type on, and we'll get to that. But typically what happens, though, in a QSO with the software is you type ahead, or you have macros that essentially fill everything in for you, and that's how DM780 works. So your call sign, the other person's call sign, right-click on the call sign, you've got that captured, right-click on the grid square, right-click on their QTH. That all goes in the logbook, and you type ahead just to get ahead. And in the case of DM780, you hit the F2 button, and it's transmitting off. Now, a lot of folks like to do real-time typing. Okay, so if you can tell pretty quick within a minute or two whether or not you're going to get into a QSO, because otherwise it'd be over by then. Okay, but if you're going to get into a QSO with somebody, they're going to come back and you're going to see the print kind of stopping and starting across the screen. And then you know that's kind of your cue to just kind of back off from the macros for a second and just type real time. And at 63 baud, you can do that no problem. Or at 31 baud even, right? It's not a problem at all. But to answer your question, it's all speed. So during contesting, what people are wanting to do is they want to go into higher bandwidth, faster transmissions so they can get that 1 minute QSO down to, 10 seconds. I would guess that they tend to be a little bit younger operators, but that's just a theory. Okay. All right, now, in the waterfall, PSK31 is very easy to identify. It tends to look, because it's phase shifting back and forth, you just get two intertwining ones and zeros, essentially, kind of like the mark in space in RTTY. So you get something that looks like DNA molecules essentially streaming down in the waterfall. All you do is you line up your cursors for the mode. The bandwidth will adjust automatically for the mode and the variation that you're running, and then you just get it close, and all the software auto-tunes to make sure it's spot on at that time to get the best print. Okay.
If you could note, you don't touch the VFO knob on your rig. This is all done.
Correct. Correct. Yeah, that's a great point. Unlike CW, for example, or sideband, that you're going to tune in, you stick your VFO typically in fast mode to just what's it called? Coarse tune mode, effectively, right? At 14070 or what have you, and the 2400, 2500 hertz that you work in is all done by the software. So you never touch the VFO after that. So there's no tuning around, it's just point and click on in the waterfall.
So the width of the waterfall is the 31 hertz?
No, the width, the 31 hertz is the spacing here. That's your 31 hertz, just the width of that line in the waterfall. And the 2500 goes all the way from 0 all the way up to 2500. And that's why so many of those QSOs or channels will fit in that 2500 hertz band. Now you've probably heard this too, and maybe didn't know it. In general, when audio is phase shifted, it tends to have that hollow can, tin can kind of a sound that you heard. So that's from the phase shifting of the audio. Another mode that's considerably more complicated in its structure and decoding and the software that goes around it, but is very powerful, is Olivia. What Olivia does is it essentially says, I'm going to have multiple tones across a fixed bandwidth, not just, say, one tone shift. I'm going to have multiple tone shifts, so I can have 4 tones, 8 tones, 16 tones, 32 tones representing my information. When you do that at 32 tones, you've got a lot of ones and zeros in there. Essentially, you've got multiple characters in one cycle, if you will. So, and the bandwidth also varies, somewhat proportionate to the number of tones used, of course, but it goes from anywhere from 250 hertz all the way up to 2000 hertz. Obviously, with 2000 hertz on a waterfall, you're taking up everything. So you'd say, well, why would anybody do that? Well, on certain bands at certain times, it's all open, it's wide open, and you may have a scheduled QSO, or you may be able to find somebody that's essentially calling CQDX out there on that mode that wants to move things along, right? Because they're essentially operating, hoping for a pileup. Now, I'll tell you right now, you never get pileups, and really to speak of in digital modes. A pileup is like 3 people in digital modes, because there's so much there available in terms of bandwidth and channel spacing that You know, it just in practice so far just hasn't happened. A lot of people, and actually a guy I have regular QSOs, refers to Olivia and Contestia as the guys up above. They're usually up on 14076, 075 or 076, and he calls them the organ grinders. That's how he refers to them, which you'll understand here in a second. That's 8-tone Olivia on a 250 hertz spacing. So, as I noted there in the second bullet, 8/250 is the popular one for Olivia. Now, why in the world would you ever care about this? Well, if there's no QRM, and here's where your 8 tones are shifting back and forth here across the 250 hertz of spectrum there. You really wouldn't care. And in fact, even though Olivia moves along because of its compactness and its efficiency, you probably wouldn't care that much. But as it turns out last night, with some of the shot noise we were getting and just general poor fading, selective fading conditions, here's the same QSO later, about 5 minutes later, kind of buried in the noise, and to the point where you really can't make it out. But and it would be tough to see with any distance at all. I apologize, but you've essentially got 100% print, even though that's 95 dB below in the noise. So you really can punch through with Olivia, and there's several other modes that can do even better than this as far as signal to noise ratio. So that's really why people have been working with it. Contestia is another variant. It's very similar to Olivia. It's quite a bit more rare. Hasn't been around quite as long as Olivia has. But as it turns out, there's redundancy built into it, and that's the key difference with it. As a result of that redundancy that's built in, to try to get even higher percent print out of Contestia, it's very slow. So if you're in a real-time QSO with somebody on Contestia, at just about any speed, usually these are all going down in the smaller bandwidths, again to conserve bandwidth in consideration of others. You can easily type this. Anyone just packing one key at a time can keep up on Contestia. It is that slow. For someone like myself that types all the time because of what I do for a living, it's kind of irritating, frankly, because it's so slow. But prints are almost always 100% accurate. Yeah,
That means though you could have a contact using very low power.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm glad you asked that question because that's something I should have put in there. Typically, to work DX, you only use about 30-35 watts. If you're working, the Midwest, you're going to be running at 10 watts, 5 or 10 watts. So one of the things that digital modes really lend themselves well to is QRP operation. The problem has been, other than rigs like that Fort Tuthill and such, there aren't a lot of QRP sideband rigs, and it's a sideband rig you really got to have to run these digital modes. So therein lies kind of the rub of it, and that's why, of course, CW has been so popular with QRP, because you get similar effects with CW, right, from a propagation and distance standpoint. But if you don't want to learn CW, if you don't want to learn Morse, then you're kind of stuck right now. So typically what people have done is they just dial their RF output back. So if they want to try to see how far they can get on minimal watts, they'll dial all the way back. My rig goes down to 10 watts. I think a lot of rigs go down to as far as 5 or lower. You can run attenuators, so on and so forth, but it is great for low power.
But if some fellows running, say, PSK31 at 100 or 200 watts,
Yeah. The splatter? Oh yeah, it splatters all over the place. Actually, the single biggest problem that seems to be out there in practice isn't that at all, isn't power levels, as near as you can tell. because there isn't a very easy visual way to discern high power versus lower power, except in how bright it is, okay? So it's true, they could be running 100 watts, but to you, that may be fine in terms of its printability, its accuracy, and just what you see on the waterfall. But the biggest problem you see is people running their preprocessor up, right? And you need a little tiny bit of it to run the digital modes, okay? Because again, the audio is coming into the mic input, okay? So the preprocessor should be there, but compression should be off, and you shouldn't run the preprocessing very high. What you'll see on, and I tried to get a good example of it, but unfortunately it doesn't transfer when you do a screen capture very well. What you get looks like mirrored echoes, essentially, off the waterfall. So you'll see just about 16 hertz in a case of PSK 31 on either side, or maybe 8 hertz, and then another 8 hertz and another 8 hertz. So they'll end up taking up 125 hertz of bandwidth, even though they're running PSK 31, because they've got that processing up too high. And it's very similar to overmodulation, essentially, right? So they're overdriving it. They're overheating their finals, which is another point I should, now that I'm thinking of this, another point to make is that one downside of digital modes that in practice isn't a big problem is that they run nearly 100% duty cycle, okay? So your equipment has to be in good shape, running over extended periods of time at 100% duty cycle. So if you've got homebrew equipment and it's not the overheating's being taken care of, isn't cooled by fans, or doesn't have adequate heat sinks, you might see a problem with overheating running digital modes. Yeah, Bob.
One of the problems that I see with newer operators on digital modes is they attempt to set the audio the same way they set their microphone.
Oh yeah.
They set the ALC up
Right.
too high instead of waiting for the ALC just to flicker slightly.
Right.
And that's where you eliminate those sidebands.
That's exactly right. Is it should just flicker just a teeny bit when you send out your message, your call, or response. It should just, the needle should just a tiny little bit, just touching that red of that ALC band. That's correct. Yeah, they well, like any newer operator, maybe without some guidance, and in this kind of a situation, there's more room for not knowing what the heck you're doing and not having anybody coming
And all
in
the radios
correcting
respond
you.
differently.
Yeah, they do. They absolutely do. I guess some will learn the hard way that when their finals blow. Hate to say that, but that's probably true. Now this Contestia recording is done. This is one of these that's barely, well, it's really not even bringing up the S meter at all. So what you're hearing, and there's a bit of a pause right now, but what you're hearing is the actual audio that comes in that then has to be decoded. That was the start tone, and now the data's being transmitted. And it sounds like, you know, the signal level came up there a little bit, but it can go down literally to the point where audibly through a speaker you can barely hear it on your rig, and it'll still print. It's great. Okay, now to shift off of the text modes, everything up till this point has essentially been typed, right? So like instant messaging, essentially. The next two have to do with beaconing and propagation studies. There's a fellow at, I think he's still at Princeton, Joe Taylor, hence the JT and JT65, who has done work, he's an astrophysicist, and he's done work to create modes that can aid in doing ionospheric propagation studies. When you run JT65, or really the next mode, Whisper, the software is specialized. It comes from Joe Taylor himself. He puts it out there free of charge. And these modes tend to run a little differently in that their intention is to run as low a power as you can possibly run. If you can get your rig down to milliwatts, you should run it at milliwatts. If you can get it down to a watt and that's it, then you should run it at a watt, or 5 watts or what have you. What's interesting about JT65 and Whisper is that is how far people will spot you. And the software actually, the online software actually, as the spots are reported in from your PC software, as these other folks are being picked up, because the call sign's coming over, the grid square's coming over, it's recording that and retransmitting it out through the internet to a central server, and then he paints a map of where all these spots are on the world. So for the time that you're running JT65 or Whisper, you can see how many people have spotted you. So you could have a conversation, or a QSO rather, in JT65, which is QSO oriented. Whisper really isn't. But you could have a QSO there and someone's copied you in Japan that night. You know, and normally you wouldn't know that, of course, obviously, because if you're having a voice QSO or a CW QSO, you really don't know who's copying you out there or how far your signal's really going. You've just made a contact and you know that, but you don't know beyond that how far your signal's going. So the really interesting thing is here is you can see a worldwide perspective of the propagation of your signal.
It may be this now the person hearing your signal, he just left his rig on in this mode.
Oh, totally.
And he
totally.
can sleep.
Yeah, much of this is unmanned.
The server.
Yeah, JT65 is a QSO-oriented deal, but Whisper is automated. Typically, you're not going to sit there for very long running Whisper because it's boring, right?
Oh, yeah.
You know, there's really nothing going on there except when the data comes back, and of course there's a little bit of a real-time delay in that. It might take a half hour later before you can refresh that map in the web browser and see where your signal got spotted. So it takes a little while from a practical standpoint. But you're right, you can leave that run for a while. And again, it's kind of a consideration of other things. He's posted some guidelines about how long you should do some of that and so on and so forth. Because, you know, if the map gets too cluttered, you can zoom in on it. But from a practical standpoint, you know, you really don't want a lot of traffic, if you will, simultaneously, right? So they try to keep it down ideally to, I think, 32 or less of these spots going on as far as transmits go at a time. And what Whisper will do is it'll actually transmit continuously for 2 minutes, but at low power. So again, you're not overheating anything at all in Whisper. Transmit for 2 minutes, and then spot for 2 minutes, and then transmit for 2 minutes, and then spot for 2 minutes, and it just repeats that. Okay. And it's just amazing where your signal goes at a few watts when you see that spot report. It's just really cool. So you'll see at times where your signal is shading towards Europe, and other times where your signal is shading towards the Pacific or south or what have you. So it's really cool. Yeah.
Now for the texting portion of this, or the QSO part,
Right.
JT65HF.
Yep.
Is the way to go.
Yeah, for
Just
this
the
kind
simple-
of, right.
Not for beaconing, not for any of the,
Correct. If you were, in fact, because of, I think, Tom's question earlier, if you were thinking, or I'm sorry,
Me?
yeah, Craig, you brought up the point about this lending itself well to QRP. JT65 seems to me to be a natural, because the ideal with JT65 is to make QSOs at 1 watt. So, it's QRP.
But I was doing it this past winter, JT65 on 160 for a while.
Yep.
And be careful when you're surfing the net and doing it at the same time, because at 50 seconds after the hour, you have to make some decisions, and then the next minute's, for 5 seconds of decision making, you have to wait another 60 seconds before the next evolution of the
Right.
signal comes back and forth.
Right.
Very slow.
Yeah, so you can fall asleep. And it's like in that minute, but
Especially late at night when the clock runs faster. Right?
well, you wake up, it's 2 minutes later, and the guy's still trying to make the connection to you. But it's interesting. I did hear a station in France running like 30 watts on 160,
Okay,
and I heard him, and contacted him on email, and he didn't hear me coming back at 5 watts,
okay,
so that was trying to make that link from where
Sure.
I'm at to him on
Sure.
160. So,
Sure.
Big difference in
Yep.
6
Yeah.
dB attenuation.
Paul,
You've mentioned all sorts of these different modes, Whisper and JT65,
contested,
yeah,
yeah,
PSK 31. Okay, suppose I bring the program up, turn on the radio 14070, and I see a whole bunch of different things in the waterfall, and I go over and I select on one of them. How do I know what mode he's running? What
Yeah.
should I be in?
yeah, that's the biggest problem, is learning how to spot which mode it is by the waterfall image. Okay, some of them are very distinctive and they're easy to figure out. Some of them are awful, frankly, to figure out. So for example, if you see someone, which is very rare, but if you saw someone running either MT63 or MFSK, it looks very, very, very different. So you'd recognize it instantly, okay? You'd only need to look at a picture once and kind of remember that to spot it again. But most of the modes are not that simple, and furthermore, what ends up happening is you don't have a clue in the case of Olivia and Contestia sometimes, how many tones they're using. You can kind of tell, again, from experience, that it's 16 tones rather than 4 tones. That's pretty easy. And you can judge on bandwidth based on what the waterfall will indicate in terms of bandwidth by just doing some simple subtraction. But what people seem to be getting away from, which is a big plus in my mind, but I haven't been seeing much of it lately, is something called RSID, where when you first transmit with RSID on, it essentially prints the mode and everything for you, and then allows you to click on it if your software supports RSID. Then all you do is click that, and everything is set for you. So you're at that point synced up with that person that sent out that RS identifier. That Reed Solomon is what it stands for, identifier. Okay. It just seems like lately in the last few months, hardly anybody's doing that for some reason. And so, yeah, when that's the case, it's really challenging. You need to learn a lot. And that's why in the deck I wanted to get some pictures. And then before I send it off to Steve, I'll have an appendix that has a bunch of sites for these modes. There's tons of sites and tons of information out there on this. I think you were first.
Is the RSID just transmitted at the beginning of the transmission?
Yes,
Yeah.
but if you don't shut it off the next time, it's every transmission. So it's kind of up to the operator typically to do it on the first transmission and then shut it off on the second transmission for the same person, for the same QSO.
All right, I use multi-PSK, and it seems to only have it at the beginning of the first transmission.
Okay. Well, they figured out a way to do it then.
Because it's
Handle
very difficult to figure out what mode should I be
It is.
listening to.
Okay, Craig, sorry.
Oh, well, this is kind of in the same vein, but I remember reading a biography of Thomas Edison. He had in 1887 a 4-wire telegraph circuit from West Orange, New Jersey to New York City. And he was doing the equivalent of 350 baud in 1887.
Yeah.
And if I remember right, didn't the old computers where you put the end set on the cradle,
Yeah, for RTTY.
wasn't that about 350
No,
baud?
110 and
300.
300.
Yeah, it was the equivalent of that. He
Yeah.
was doing that in 1887 on a
Yeah.
4-wire circuit.
Yeah, well, those guys were brilliant, and they didn't have the means that we have today to leverage their brilliance, which sometimes makes me feel kind of lazy at times. But I think, a lot of this stuff is this whole encoding, and a lot of the digital signal processing technology that's built into the software now has been in existence for 50 plus years. It's only now that it's been, able to be leveraged in silicon and software to be able to make it a reality that's affordable. Larry?
Back to the RSIDs, what I usually see happening, if I'm listening on one spot in the waterfall, if it appears anywhere in that spectrum, that RSID, it'll give me a message saying such and such mode is available on frequency and,
Right.
and it'll give the option to
Right.
click on it, go right to it.
Right, right. Yeah, so you can click on it, or you can see that the one at 1850, for example, is that one in the waterfall that's just transmitted, that kind of thing. The other thing that helps it from a practical standpoint is to make it so that if you haven't tried this yet, not to discourage you, is that the frequency allocations, the gentleman's agreements, have worked pretty well with digital modes in terms of where you're going to find people running certain modes. Yeah, there's exceptions like there always is, because it's more of a wild, wild west and more of a mix than you get between CW and sideband. People tend to honor that pretty well, so there's a little bit less of that. But most of the time, you know, if you want to go to 14070 or 7070, 10140, those PSK 31 frequencies, they're going to be run PSK 31. Okay, and that's one of the reasons it's become so popular, I think, is because it ends up being less work to get started and less learning to get started with PSK 31. Yeah.
Yeah, I have been working with some JT65. One night, 20 meters, couldn't hear a thing on the band, and worked into South America. You couldn't even see them on the waterfall.
Yeah, that's not uncommon.
That's very common.
Yeah.
Other question was...
Which makes it tricky to find people.
You said it on 14076 for the JT65.
Right. Right.
Is this the same frequency, or is there another frequency for WSPR?
Whisper's got
They're separate, yeah. I don't know how that actually in practice gets shaken out, but it does.
Okay.
And now compared to just a year ago, in Ham Radio Deluxe, what it does is that if you pick a mode and then you hover over a band, then it has the frequencies listed that are popular for that band, for that mode, okay? And they keep updating that. Somehow it's kind of getting all straightened out as we're here, you're there, you other guys, you know, the organ grinders are over here, you know.
Also related to that, with the HRD software, I noticed the Ham Radio Deluxe was defaulted to 14070.15. Is there any reason for that? Normally I've just been setting it back to readjusting it to exactly 7.0.
I guess I'd contact them about that and see if you can make an adjustment in HRD to
Well, you
fix
can,
that.
because I can reset those, yes.
Okay. Huh. Craig?
Have they got to a point where they will, let's say, tune your receiver and do a band scan and say, this guy's doing JT65 or whatever?
Well, in the high-end, the newest high-end rigs that copy it for you, in other words, they have TFT LCD displays sitting there on those rigs, right? Multi-purpose, tons of buttons, general purpose soft keys. So one of the things you can do with a TS990 or the new FTDX 3000 is you can hit a soft key function and essentially puts that in waterfall mode, and then right above it, it prints the text. Okay, but it also tells you what mode it is, if it handles it. And right now, they only handle just a few modes, those rigs, built into the rigs, okay, without the PC and without the software. But that's kind of a direction, although it's a pricey thing, because obviously the rigs I just named are not cheap. You know, right now, the expensive rigs can be run that way without just a keyboard and without any PC. It's possible to do that, but almost everyone else is pretty much, you know, doing it the way I do it, and I'm sure others in the room do it with just a TNC box or an interface box coming in. Okay, just got a couple more of these. Treiber is just kind of an interesting thing. This one I haven't played around with from the standpoint of QSOs and such. There's a whole subculture, just like anything out there, to Treiber. Whole societies.
Ponytails and earth shoes?
Yeah, maybe. I know there's a whole group that's out of Texas, and I'm not sure what their deal is, but there's quite a few members, so I don't know. But the way I described it is the way it's typically described, is it kind of looks like facts on a ticker tape, because in the viewable area, instead of seeing text printed out as it would be normally on a computer screen or say a word processing software, an editor, what you get are strips, and then you see an image being drawn on there, on those strips, just as if it was a fax coming in, right, a facsimile. So there's a couple weird things about Hellschreiber, like you always get 2 of those instead of 1, and that's again for data integrity or copyability.
Well, it's because originally when they did Hellschreiber, they were printing devices.
Right.
And if it got skewed, you couldn't read it.
Right.
If they double it, someplace along there's gonna be a version that lines up.
Yeah, it came out of Germany, I
Yeah.
think, originally, right? And then the machine was kind of like a ticker tape, kind of a printer,
Yeah.
but also like a fax, and stuff was just coming in whenever and then printing. Yeah, it's got, like I said, it's got a whole following. But essentially, it uses what's called tone burst encoding, much like CW, but think of it more as having a tone there and then just burst gating that. So you had a tone, and then off is completely off, and then a tone, and then off. And so it ends up being like CW that runs about 35 words a minute, just continuous and without mistakes, in theory, right? The thing that's, the sound, this particular clip doesn't really do it justice, because
More guttural than that.
yeah, and it reminds, it's sort of like guttural and irritating, like fingers on a chalkboard. That has more of a kind of a sonar sound with some echoing to it and whatnot. But anyway, it's an interesting mode. It, like some of the other modes, can get through conditions of high QRM. This one's fairly easy to spot. That's not the greatest example, but essentially you have a single line that's coming and then some deviation from that single line that's essentially on both sides. So it'll wiggle and give you a symmetric looking burst of lines in there. And that's what it looks like when you get the print from a particular ribbon or whatever the nomenclature is on Hellschreiber. Someone's calling CQ there on the West Coast. Okay. Any other questions?
So is Pactor digital mode?
Yeah, good example, or good question of some other ones. Pactor, Amtor, Packet, which is very much like computer modem to computer modem, X.25. Those are all digital modes as well. And this book that put up by the ARRL, which a lot of people I'm sure have seen, covers just a couple of the common popular modes. It's not an all-encompassing book. When Steve Ford put this out, I'm sure today it would be 2 or 3 times the thickness that it is right now if he was trying to be comprehensive with it. But it's a good book in terms of getting started with it, as the title suggests, because it covers the background on things, the kind of equipment that's available and what you need to get set up, the kind of software that's available out there. Does cover things like Whisper and JT65, so Pactor, Amtor, the rest of it kind of, gives it some words to print, but more extensive in PSK 31 and RTTY, the more popular modes, for sure. But it's a pretty good book. I don't remember the cost of it, but I seem to think it's something along the lines of $20. Tom?
Is there much field day activity with digital modes?
Much.
Field day.
From what I understand, last year when I went around to about a half a dozen different field days, no one was running digital locally here. But at home, there was a ton of activity just watching what was going on field day, or that weekend. So yeah, I know there are some clubs that are deep into this, the Hellschreiber guys, for example, again, that do it up big time. But it doesn't seem to be here locally, a lot of it yet. Locally, what I observed is what you'd expect, CW and sideband.
I've been on JT65, but these internet servers is new to me. Is there an address to go to.
Yeah, I'll have all that in the appendix, yeah, for like Whisper and the whole mapping and all that, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, back.
It occurs to me that the ham adapter's a lot better at seeing a new signal pop up in the bandstand.
Oh, yeah.
The waterfall seems to kind of move along slow, and then this thing slowly appears. Whereas if you got the scope on,
Right.
it's easier to distinguish where to click to.
Right.
Mouse click on that.
Right.
You prefer the waterfall?
I'm used to it. I'm just more used to it. What he's pointing out is some people would probably look at something like our TTY, for example, seeing that kind of thing in a spectral sense, right? A frequency versus amplitude versus a waterfall of our TTY, where those peaks are going to line up as intertwined pretzel or licorice twists or whatever. And you know, some people do prefer to see it, you know, as a waveform, because some of the modes in particular look really weird as a waveform, whereas they may look the same in the waterfall. They don't in the band adapter. You're exactly right. But I've just gotten used to just using the waterfall and spotting them. And again, you know, over the winter, especially in the depths of it, when there was a lot of activity for obvious reasons, a lot of folks were using RSID. And in fact, when I first got on, it was so nice because I just click. I'd see a new mode that I hadn't spotted before, click it, watch it, you know, listen to it, turn the speaker volume up on the rig to listen to it, and watch the patterns in the waterfall. And you just get used to it. You know, the more you see it, the more used to it. The problem with the exotic ones is you rarely see them. MT63, you know, is, for example, is a really rare one. And it's been around for years. It's actually something the military first started using before radio amateurs did. But you rarely see it being used by anyone.
It's used a lot with Mars.
Yeah, Mars
Every day.
operation. Oh, every day?
Practically, yeah.
Oh, okay.
But that's my question is, where can you get reliable information about this stuff, especially MT63?
You mean not off the internet?
Try.
Oh, come on.
Their Alabama Mars and Navy Mars has they both have MT63 pages. And you can't get people to believe it. It's terrible. I mean, it works maybe 1/4 of the time you can get information transmitted.
Okay.
But you can't get people to believe what the internet says about it, and they run 80 or 100 watts and you don't get anything.
I don't know. That's a good question on that one specifically. I'm not sure. Generally speaking, most hams, just like most anyone that has a blog or maintains a website, tries to have relatively accurate information.
But that's one of the problems. There's so many people out there doing that. Which ones
I agree.
know what they're talking
I
about?
agree. I have a blog, and you know what I blog is stuff that I can't find, and I
Yeah.
discover. That's what I blog. Because, you know, years ago when the internet was first coming into its own, you'd find 14 different blog posts or 100 different websites on the exact same thing.
Yeah.
And that's a bit irritating, you know, frankly. So, and obviously completely redundant. In the last few years in particular, that seems to have kind of gone away. I mean, that seems to be more the rarity now. And now when you hop around, look for information, like if you put in PSK 31, no space into Google, hit enter, you're going to find some ham radio sites there, but you're not going to find 400 of them. You're going to find a selection of them. And Google ranking is in large part based, not completely obviously, but in large part based on how much material is there against that search term. So you're going on the first page of a Google search, you should see the folks that have the most information about that particular mode if you just put the mode in and search for it. Yeah, or see.
Yeah, I ran a digital station at Phil Day for about 8 years, and what happens is, it's a contest, you know. There's a lot of people out there doing it, but it was and the people you're working with who have the CW and the phone don't like you very well because you're really not gonna pile up the points like they do, so.
No, that's an excellent point. Yeah, you're not gonna pile up points like you would on QRP and CW on, on any kind of contest.
You get 2 points for every contact, but you're still not gonna be able to, no matter how many contacts you make and how fast you make them, you're gonna be way behind the others, so.
Oh, there's some pros out there. There's been, the multiplier and the mode where, people have argued about how many points you can rack up on RTTY versus other modes. There's been whole gory discussions, bloody discussions over that kind of thing, right?
I've seen teletype contests rip along pretty fast.
Yeah.
Because everybody's 18 teletype operators running, and it's like,
Chuck?
Enough type